Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Topic tonight is really Trudeau, our current Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, versus Pierre Poilievre and how things have changed. And I want to introduce you to a really interesting gentleman who's written a really fascinating article recently, John Delacourt. He is the Senior Vice President at a firm called Counsel Public Affairs. Maybe later on in the show, I'll tell you a little bit more about his background because it's really quite fascinating. But he's written an article called The Radical Proposition of Trust and Trudeau's Response to His Latest Opponent. It was published a week ago in a magazine called policymagazine.ca. And John, tell us a little bit about your argument, if you could, because it sounds to me, after reading it, that it really broke down to, you said that the Liberals are trying to create trust and Poilievre's trying to create grievances or score on grievances, and that those are the two different propositions, they're two different strategies. Tell me a little bit about what your argument is, please, sir.
Absolutely. It has been, I think, a period of great transition for the Conservatives over the last 2 years. And I think the pandemic, I think, brought into the foreground some of the affordability issues for Canadians that the government has struggled to connect with. And I think astutely, Pierre Poilievre has seen an opening here. The everyday affordable questions of the price of groceries, the price of gas, the pumps. His leadership campaign, I think, accentuated his particular talent for communicating effectively. As a Liberal, was watching a lot of the videos during his campaign that he would send out via Twitter and via various social media platforms, and was realizing there was a great deal of potential here for some momentum with the Conservatives. And as a Liberal as well, one of the challenges I realized is, and this is perhaps the challenges of incumbency and governing, is that if during this period of great transition that we've all gone through, there is a sense that the government is not necessarily responding as effectively to these affordability questions, that there is an opening that emerges. Of course, I took these questions to my colleagues in government, and I found the response, for me anyway, some consolation, in the sense that where the government and where the Prime Minister himself sees perhaps an opportunity over the coming months to gain some traction with Canadians again, are on what they call the tangibles, the questions that will address perhaps more effectively these questions of affordability. I think, a great example that they're putting in the window, and early on with this confidence supply agreement that they have with the NDP, is this agreement on dental care. And for ordinary working families, as they would say in their key messaging, this will be a key affordability question, significantly, especially for kids under 12, which is the initial focus of it. But also, the benefits of the Canada Child Benefit, the child care agreement. What they're hoping is that these once again, these sort of like affordability questions will start to gain traction as Canadians see some benefits, month to month. And how that will play out, though, in contrast to an anti-inflation message that Poilievre is currently advancing, still remains to be seen. But the ground, I think, has been established. I guess the battle coordinates have been established on these affordability questions. So I think that's what we're going to see play out.
You suggest in your article that usually there's a étude brute kind of situation or a walk in the snow or something like that, and you're saying it's not happening.
Yeah, that's correct. I think a lot of people were presuming, given the Prime Minister's I guess, preoccupation with some of the larger challenges, say the extreme weather events and the climate change challenges that have created, be it wildfires out west, or the challenges with the hurricane in the eastern part of the country recently too. That there were, aside from, say, the larger conflict in Ukraine as well, that there were these larger events, these macro events that were preoccupying both the government and the prime minister over the last little while, and that as I say in the piece, we're presuming that because we're not necessarily hearing from the prime minister on the sort of the affordability questions, the ground that Poilievre has set, that somehow he's kind of quiet quitting or something. What I would suggest here is that the prime minister is taking Poilievre very seriously. And, meetings on election readiness occur all the time. And what the prime minister is doing is effectively also providing his cabinet with the license and the platform to speak to the individual policy areas and fronts that are currently a challenge, and where possible, they hope, as legislation moves over, like the dental care legislation, that they can once again set those coordinates on affordability questions and actually engage with the opposition to suggest that there is a clear contrast. So in that sense, to summarize, I would say it's like, just watch this space in terms of how the prime minister will engage in the months ahead. It'll be in those key areas of legislation. It'll be in those key areas of affordability that we'll see emerging as early as next week with the fall economic statement on the November 3rd for all your listeners, but also for with the budget. I think that's where you'll start to see the true battle lines emerge.
But I guess what I got from your one of the things I got from your piece is that you don't think Trudeau is, and you quote that he's a former boxer, but he's not going to stoop to Poilievre's strategy and get involved in a WrestleMania, back and forth right now. He's going to build over time, and he's going to build trust over time based on these policy issues, and that he's doing good for Canadians. I want to come back to this after the break and ask you whether that's actually possible, and also that he's giving a lot more latitude more recently to the team when it all, it used to be all about him, and now numerous different ministers are, as you say, racking up those frequent flyer miles and jetting around and seeming to have a lot more latitude. We're going to take a break, and we're going to be back in 2 minutes with John Delacourt. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is John Delacourt. He is someone very experienced in public affairs in Canada. He's currently the Senior Vice President for Council Public Affairs. He has been a Vice President with Hill & Knowlton Strategies, with Ensight Canada, and he was Director of Communications at the Liberal Research Bureau. And before that, in numerous other communications organizations. One that I want to ask you about, you worked for Thornley Fallis Communications at one point in time. I remember Joe Thornley and Terry Fallis is renowned as a novelist, so that kind of must be of an interesting experience working with those two gentlemen. But today's topic is Trudeau versus Poilievre, and how the presence of Poilievre, who you've described as a great communicator, has changed things for the Liberal Party. And I got to step back and ask you, because it was actually almost interesting. Just this weekend in the Globe and Mail, there was a huge article, I'm not sure if you've read it, that is almost the opposite argument than what you're making, which is kind of interesting, where the author argued that the Liberal Party is on a long decline and has lost significant ground, both in the general population, but also with males, particularly, and the self-described sort of feminist prime minister has been doing okay with females, but terrible with males, and that's the big challenge. I interviewed the director of communications for the Jean Charest campaign, who said that they thought that the vast majority, they said 70 to 80% of the new people that had joined the Conservative Party for the leadership were white males between the ages of 25 and 40. And that Poilievre had really been able to resonate with frustrated young men and their grievances. And that this was a huge problem for Charest. And it's a huge problem going forward for Trudeau. So tell me, how do you think that argument plays with your argument about just build long-term trust over time?
It's significant. And it was one of the questions I actually posed to my colleagues within the party, specifically those who work closely with the Prime Minister. I think a complexity of issues or reasons why there's been that erosion of support from male voter. I think, part of it, you could say, is on that focus of gender equity and gender balance within the cabinet, and the fact that the Prime Minister has often spoken about this as a key component of their government. And I think it's also related to the fact that, the government has also advanced as much as possible, larger issues of equity that we've seen play out, of course, in the culture wars battles south of the border. And so, in essence, they've tried to align themselves with what they see as a true progressive front. And I think it's important to view this in the context of the larger political arena, of course, right? In the sense that, we do see a coarsening of the dialogue on all social media platforms. We do see, I think, a real sense that, that just the very tenets of democratic dialogue are in question right now in some of the larger democracies in Europe right now. And so there is a sense that the government had to sort of, put its stakes in the ground in terms of its progressive vision. And I think that that's always been a key part of, the government's mandate. And they felt that, that spoke to their base as strongly and as clearly and as eloquently as they could about the direction this government wanted to take. However, I would say that during the period of the pandemic, especially for younger males, questions of advancement, questions of opportunity, the hope narrative that's oxygen to any political campaign, that hope narrative has been challenged, of course, and by way of an anecdote, by way of a voter who the Liberals, I think, would view as part of their base. I think of a younger male in the 905 area. I think of those, as my background would suggest, like the cohort that would go to Raptors games, and who graduated out of university perhaps over the last 5 years, has perhaps a strong background in IT or coding, and yet because of the pandemic, has been their progress, their economic status has flatlined. So that person coming out of university cannot buy a home. That person coming out of university is challenged to say to his partner, well, maybe over the next 5 years, we can start a family, and we can all of this sort of the markers of progress and prosperity have been delayed a little bit, and you could say that that's owing to the pandemic, but it's also owing to some of the larger macroeconomic things that we're seeing happening in the world right now. And yet, there is a clear sense that the government is not necessarily responding effectively to that. Once again, I say it may simply be the challenges of incumbency and the fact that, a lot of these issues are global in nature. And yet the government is in the crosshairs for a lot of those younger male voters. And I think that male voters, across the demographic spectrum too.
But at the same time, what they got attracted to and moved to was this call for freedom. this rallying cry that was almost I'm not sure if it is from an economic standpoint, but sort of libertarian in its orientation, and not wanting to be forced to wear masks, not wanting to be forced to not go to Raptors games, vaccine passports. But does this desire for sort of a libertarian freedom orientation extend to the economy? And how does that compare with redistribution policies of childcare, dental care, things like that?
Absolutely. And I think it's based on this, that one of the key ballot questions you always give to the voter, of course, is, has your life improved over the last 5 years? Has your life improved since the last election? And it's really difficult, I think, to say to to this male cohort or constituency of voters that things have improved. And again, when we speak of a hope narrative, where the oxygen is for any campaign momentum, it is around that sense of opportunity. And that aligns really well with the language of freedom right now. The government was in a position where on a daily basis during the worst of the pandemic, the prime minister was out there speaking at the podium about all the restrictions and the constraints on freedom, necessary as they may have been. That was the overarching narrative that was playing out during that time. It is really difficult then to pivot on that and then be the spokesperson for hope and opportunity when you have basically been focused on speaking to what you cannot do in that period, when again it was for the larger concerns of public health measures and the safety of kids going to school at some point soon. All of that was again necessary precautions, but it did not, those weren't clarion notes of freedom that were being rung every day as the prime minister walked out and spoke to the podium and addressed those key questions that people had about when are we going to get back to normal, and normal as equated with freedom was something that there was an opening there for the opposition, and the opposition, of course, astutely took it.
I had a really interesting discussion with a couple of young men just about a week or two ago, where they said that this was a generational issue, because it was people my age and older that really wanted a lot of those COVID restrictions because we were at risk. And it was people their age and younger that didn't care because even if they got COVID, they weren't going to get sick. Or if they got sick, they weren't certainly going to go to the hospital and die. And, all the statistics sort of bear that out. And that on this affordability issue, they would argue that a potential housing crisis is spectacular for them and not murderous, but very damaging for me. As if we see a 20% or 30% collapse in housing prices, which many people think is completely called for, that we've had this bubble over the course of the last little while, homeowners over the ages of, 45, 55, 60, could lose 20%, 30% of their net worth.
That's right.
But young people that Poilievre is connecting with can't afford homes today, but might actually in the future. And when you think about some of the issues of redistribution, that's something that, some people want, but a lot of people know they want freedom. They want economic opportunity. They want the chance for prosperity. And so it's almost a juxtaposition between what's attractive for older people that Trudeau is appealing to versus younger, particularly ambitious males that Poilievre is appealing to. What do you think of that?
I think that's absolutely right. It's one of the challenges again is how do you create the room for economic growth again? The growth narrative is something that has been a real challenge for this government to effectively articulate. In the last budget, Chrystia Freeland effectively stated, that among the OECD countries, our challenge for economic growth was real, and that translates for the younger voter, the younger male voter, specifically, of a kind of a flatlining of opportunity. And that is something that I think the government really has to figure out how to address. I think your juxtaposition of who wins if the housing bubble breaks, the juxtaposition of the demographic juxtaposition that you've raised there, I think is a really important one. And again, it falls to the government to inject some sense of hope for those younger Canadians who are, I think, who are hoping that, as they think about where they're going to be in the next 20 years, the home they're going to own, the family that they hope to, that they'll flourish and nurture. All of those concerns, I think, all of a sudden become election ballot questions. As I'll only cite the Raptors one more time on this, in the sense that it's really interesting to watch over the last 2 or 3 years, the ads that are run in between, in the commercial breaks. 3 or 4 years ago to now, all of these, of course, are algorithmically determined. In other words, what keeps eyeballs on the screen: wealth management, cryptocurrency or digital currency, and questions of how to generate wealth for those folks who are watching. And I think that really speaks to where a lot of younger voters are going right now. It was interesting to me Tasha Keridan recently published a book about the direction the Conservatives, the opportunity that the center affords for them, how to claim the center. And one of the data points that she raised was the fact that 48% of younger voters would now identify as conservative, which is significant. And the progressive voter is more aligned with the NDP. So the Liberals are in that space now where they're trying to figure out how to claim the center again. And I think that once again it's a longer term challenge. I don't think it's going to get solved over the next 6 months. And I think that the Liberals are fully aware of that. It's going to take longer for them to address some of these questions that the opposition is going to be raising in the House over the next 6 months.
Some of the issues that you talked about, though, cryptocurrency and blockchain, et cetera. Mm-hmm. For a couple of years, that was really about freedom, and that was almost like a lottery game, a get rich quick kind of game, and a lot of people were attracted to it. But now that it's created huge losses, and looks more like a lottery game than really, not even as positive as day trading, but certainly not long-term wealth management. Yeah. Does that call into question that whole sort of freedom strategy?
I thought it was really interesting that in the first address the Prime Minister had in the House this year, he brought that issue to the foreground and said to the voters who were listening, and again, it's probably a smaller cohort than we can probably draw any larger conclusion with, but it was interesting. Both he and Chrystia Freeland mentioned the fact that if you had followed Poilievre's advice to invest in cryptocurrency or in some of these, these opportunities within the digital currency space over the last 6 months, you could have seen your life savings evaporate, which I thought was a really, that's an opening for the Liberals to speak to. But whether it resonates,
well, and supply side economics and follow, firing of the governor of the Bank of Canada, Liz Truss proved, that can destroy your economy.
Exactly. And I mentioned in a kind of probably too irreverent way the challenge with advancing a larger economic narrative on that older approach, that supply side economics approach. Where there is a real challenge there, and I think the government astutely is aware of this, is it is the fact that only polarizes the electorate that much more. if you're really speaking to the advantages that will open up for the 1% of Canadians who would benefit from the tax regime that Poilievre is advancing, then you do provide the government with an opening there to speak to the failings of that approach. And I think you raise a great example there as, what Britain had tried there, how they tried to sort of inject perhaps in, the nostalgia of Thatcher's era, some sense of what the UK economy, how it was revitalized in the 80s. It's really difficult to sell that because long term, because the effects, I think, the damage that it has done to the equality narrative in the UK, and I would say the damage that it's done in the US as well, I think Canadians are acutely aware of.
I don't know if Canadians are acutely aware of, frankly. I think that a lot of people are attracted by it. And we haven't seen it in the Canadian press that much, at least I didn't. But, the amount of American right-wing commentators that were, bragging that this is exactly what a new Republican administration would implement, or a new Republican Congress would implement.
Yeah,
I was shocked by, and then they kept quiet when the financial markets responded so negatively toward the strategy. So it's still a strategy that appeals to people, and maybe it could work in an okay fiscal time period. But when inflation is high and deficits and debt are at an extreme, and you've got to sort of stop inflation, it sort of doesn't work. And what happened the last month in the United Kingdom proved it out for sure. We're going to take a break and then come back in a couple of minutes with John Delacourt, who's written a really interesting article about Trudeau, our prime minister, and the Liberal Party strategy in the face of the newly elected leader of the Conservative Party, and what has to change, and maybe what's not going to change, no matter what the Conservative Party puts forward as far as a populist, very excellent communicator as a leader. Be back in 2. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is John Delacourt. He's senior counsel with Counsel Public Relations. Tell me a little bit about the firm that you're with and what you do, sir.
Absolutely. Counsel Public Affairs has both a federal and a provincial focus. We work with clients in a range of sectors, and our focus, as much as possible, is as public affairs has evolved and I think changed over the last 3 years, to really to foreground as much as possible those in those key sectors for economic growth, to foreground how our base of clients can work effectively with government. And I do a lot of work from sector to sector. We're some of my key colleagues include just Seamus Murphy, who worked in the provincial government, in the Wynne government, and Brad Levine, who often does pundit spots, will be recognized as someone who was key with the Jack Layton team. Our work at the provincial level is pan-Canadian. We go across the country, but both Seamus and I work here in Ottawa. You
reference that Trudeau's giving people in his cabinet a little bit more latitude today, that it's a little bit less of a focus on just him. And you've mentioned, I think, Chrystia Freeland like 4 or 5 times in our conversation so far today. She made a very important speech just a couple of days ago that really was different in flavor and tenor than you would have expected from Trudeau, particularly relative to autocratic authoritarian regimes worldwide and what our strategy should be. You haven't mentioned Wilkinson, but he's also been making noises that almost sound like we should be more open to natural resource development, which is something that I think a lot of people thought we weren't going to be doing because of environmental concerns, and that the environmentalists had taken over the federal cabinet. This article that I mentioned about the Liberal Party on the weekend spoke about how in the past the Liberal Party's success was because there was always some people that were business liberals within the party, as well as the more socially progressive liberals. But it suggested that today the Liberal Party had been completely dominated by the progressive, redistributive side of Liberal politics, and there weren't that many business people left. Do you think, reading the two articles sort of together, that what this is creating an opportunity for some people on, I wouldn't say the right, maybe the center, but at least right of the majority of people in the current Liberal Party cabinet to have more latitude, to make more of a statement, to earn a little bit more frequent flyer miles as they get out there and you make a point?
Yeah, I do think that I think it's a misconception to presume that that especially within the Liberal cabinet, there is not a strong awareness of speaking to those stakeholders that drive the economy, speaking to them effectively, and responding to what might be the opportunities that are emerging. I think over the last week, what we've heard with regard to the government's position on nuclear energy, I think is indicative of this. There's a clear sense, I think, that Jonathan Wilkinson, as you mentioned, but Chrystia Freeland in her speech to the Brookings Institute that you referenced as well, are really trying to set different coordinates for economic growth for the resource sector, for critical minerals, where they see in that that as they say, the messy multipolarity of issues around the world right now, ways in which Canada can perhaps increase its economic opportunity for trade exports and in the resource sector. In other words, as Europe goes into crisis, given everything that's happening with Ukraine, all of a sudden, the opportunities for our resource sector and all of a sudden starts to look really good. As an energy supplier, all of a sudden we start to look like a key partner. I think that the government is clearly aware where they can get a foothold in what might be some real opportunities. So I think this is a welcome development, especially for those liberals who do tack more to perhaps the right of the Liberal Party. Those who I think are identified with sort of that Chrétien era voter and that Chrétien era supporter of the Liberal Party. But I would say that, as I said, it's almost a caricatured misconception to presume that the current Liberal Party is not aware of how they have to respond to industry and work more effectively with industry. The one minister that I would mention in this regard, of course, is François-Philippe Champagne, who is really on a mission right now to bring those voices from industry and from those sectors that perhaps haven't had an airing with this government. He's really on a mission to bring them back to the table.
Let me challenge you on that. You referenced this book about what's the challenge with the Conservative Party today earlier in our conversation. And what I got from that book was that there's no place in the political spectrum today for what I would have called, what she called red Tories or blue liberals, and that the Conservative Party is moved to the right with Pierre Poilievre. The Liberal Party, the way she describes it, is really partnered up with the NDP and become redistributive and socialist oriented. And there's nowhere for blue liberals and red Tories, and that's a gaping hole. How do you justify that comment with your comment that business voices can be heard within the Liberal cabinet?
Well, I would say, and with all due credit and respect to Ms. Carradine, because I think Tasha is a really smart political commentator. But I would say that whenever you actually have to put something together as well researched and as grounded in policy as her book is, it is also a bit of a snapshot, right? Snapshot that's based on say the priorities of government, that the mandate letter commitments of the government that they've articulated effectively from the last campaign. The economy is moving very quickly right now, as we know. The real challenges are about what affects long-term effects. The prospect of stagflation is something that I think not only the Canadian government, but of course the U.S. government is acutely aware of. And I think that there's a clear sense that that this government wants to, not only with its fiscal policy, but also with its monetary policy, address that larger challenge. And you cannot do that unless you bring those key voices to the table. How can you craft a growth narrative without bringing critical mineral sector to the table? How can you do that without bringing industry to the table to say, how do we solve these supply chain challenges? All of those conversations are not necessarily sidebar conversations as they were maybe a year ago. Now they're coming to the center stage for this government.
But where is the business voice within the Liberal cabinet? It was just pointed out in this other article this weekend. There's like 2 people that have got any kind of business experience. They're all teachers, lawyers, etc.
To me, the one story this government has not told effectively, and perhaps because maybe they couldn't have, was what happened during the whole period when NAFTA was threatened, or where perhaps Canada's benefits with the NAFTA agreement was threatened. I think we can all remember it. I know that now it's receding into Canadian history to remember that with the Trump administration, there was a clear and present threat for the manufacturing sector, notably for the steel sector. And what I would cite there is why the story hasn't necessarily been told effectively is the team that was working with Chrystia Freeland to manage through this whole challenge is indicative of how they can work effectively with the big players for our economy. What Chrystia Freeland was doing during that period of time, I remember I was lobbying for a steel company at the time, and it was continually surprising to me that she would be texting the North American CEO to tell him where things were going. He was brought to the cabinet table to speak to what he knew of what was happening in Washington. There was a great deal of work happening in the background with those key players of our economy, and I think that it was no surprise to me that all of a sudden Freeland's political fortunes rose accordingly, and soon after she was vaulted to that role of the deputy prime minister.
Well, certainly she got credit for standing up to Trump, but the story that you're telling of really partnership with business, or at least having business involved, has not been said. Last question on this. Then the former Minister of Finance came out and was very critical of the Liberal government and saying that there hadn't been a prosperity agenda.
Yeah. Well, I think, and I would say that timing had a lot to do with what we saw happening there. I think where we saw a rift emerging in such dramatic form was sort of like a prelude to what we saw with the rollout of the stimulus measures with the pandemic. The sense that the government needed to respond quickly to some of those economic challenges that they saw, and again, motivated by what they were seeing south of the border too, with what was being recommended, but from the Federal Reserve's perspective, there were larger, what I would say, macroeconomic issues to the government's tack to the left at the time that Morneau bridled against. And I think that it was, different interpretations about what were the markers of long-term economic growth. does that dialogue, does that dynamic still exist within government? It did not leave with Morneau's exit. This is still an active and engaged conversation with this government of how to effectively tack in the right direction for economic growth, long-term economic growth.
Well, so, and I think that the current fight against inflation is proof positive that maybe the governments actually did more than they needed to do, and the deficit financing worldwide with the Biden administration, with the Western world, with certainly Canada, was that we spent more money than we needed to spend, and we created an inflationary situation, obviously compounded by supply chain issues, the war in Ukraine, etc. But we got it wrong. We spent too much money.
I think if you take a look at that larger question of the monetary policy over the last 6 months, I think it was no surprise that you saw Chrystia Freeland, one of her larger opportunities to explain the long-term strategy. She partnered with Janet Yellen, and they both sat down and spoke to what was essentially a kind of like, they were in lockstep. The federal government has been working in lockstep with the U.S.'s approach to this in many respects. I'm pausing, fully expecting to hear someone from Freeland's team to send me a text saying, well, wait a second, we weren't necessarily in lockstep. Of course, there are nuances to this, but I do think you make a valid point about how they were trying to prepare in working together and in alignment as best they could to manage these things. And let's face it, it is an inexact science. And it is a cliche to say that these are unprecedented times, but it's true, as most cliches are.
We hope this is the 1 in 100-year pandemic, no question. We hope it's unprecedented times. My guest tonight is John Delacourt. He's the Senior Vice President at Council Public Affairs. He's written really a very interesting article. I recommend it to you, called The Radical Proposition of Trust and Trudeau's Response to His Latest Opponent, in policymagazine.ca. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments. And I'm going to ask about national patriotism and pride, because I think one of the things that John has mentioned during the breaks is he's apologized for his references to the Raptors. And it's almost as if Canadians too often apologize for our patriotism. And I'm going to ask him about that. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio on Saga Night 60. My guest tonight is John Delacourt. He is the Senior Vice President of Council Public Affairs. He's written an article, The Radical Proposition of Trust and Trudeau's Response to His Latest Opponent, which I really, really enjoyed. And his argument is that Trudeau has a long-term view, and the Liberal Party and the cabinet of this long-term view, and they're going to be working on a bunch of different policies in regards to childcare and dental care and other things, such that in a year or two, we're all going to be trusting him, versus Poilievre, who is a great communicator and John freely admits is someone that Trudeau is going to have to up his game to compete with, but that he's not going to get down in sort of the WrestleMania muck, as I think that, John, you didn't say muck, but you said WrestleMania in your article, to get into this grievance politics kind of issues. He's going to play the long game, which I think was kind of an interesting comment, and I really enjoyed your article.
Thank you.
During the break, you apologized for referencing the Raptors as often as you did. I got to ask you a question, because this other article that I talked about this weekend talked about how the Liberal Party used to be the party that was proud of Canada, and yet Trudeau has apologized so many times for a whole bunch of different things in the past, almost such that you became negative about Canada's history, listening to Trudeau. Has the Liberal government lost its connections with Canada? And I reference this where, I've had a couple of experiences recently where I've spoken to people about the Canadian flag, and they've said that they've lost confidence in the Canadian flag and love for the Canadian flag because it's been taken over by the trucker convoy, and it's almost a Confederate-like flag. I interviewed some Black Canadians, some African Canadians from Brampton, who said that if they had done some of the same things that the guys in Ottawa did, that they would have been arrested and put in jail right away, if not shot. And that because they had hockey jerseys on and baseball caps and were holding the Canadian flag, they got a more lenient response. I interviewed some Indigenous people from Saskatchewan that said they took the flags down because the Canadian flag today was like the Confederate flag, and that it represented something differently. This rallying cry of freedom, of F. Trudeau that you see almost all the time as well. Yeah. And the use of the Canadian flag. Has that taken the Canadian flag and pride for Canada away from the Liberal Party? And you've referenced the Raptors. The Raptors and We the North really resonated with Canadians.
Absolutely.
But again, that's with this sort of young male population. Do the Liberals have to do something to regain that pride in Canada?
It's a really interesting question, because you cannot talk about these challenges to representing Canada proudly without speaking about some of those areas of Canadian identity that have always been foundational, have been challenged over the last 5 years. The reconciliation, we cannot talk about this without talking about the reconciliation narrative with Indigenous peoples, of course. And it is really difficult if you take a closer look at this, at how this is played out, for you to speak of the legacy of everything that has come to light for us, and somehow then pivot and say, yeah, but we're Canadians and we'll work through this, and we'll come to reconciliation together again. It is hard, given some of the truths that we've had to acknowledge, to ring those hopeful notes once again. I think that's been a significant component to this. I would also mention, most recently, in 2016, the government, the Trudeau government, had its policy conference in Halifax, and I remember it was just after there was that accident with the hockey team in Saskatchewan, and the tragedy of those young lives lost. And Ralph Goodale delivered the opening speech and spoke. And one of the key things that was a non-starter for him was he was going to start that speech and talk about that first and foremost. And everything that we're seeing with Hockey Canada and that part of the Canadian identity is being examined in terms of what was swept under the carpet over the last decade, and probably longer too, in terms of course, same challenges in terms of the military, what we know. So all of a sudden, these foundational components of Canadian identity, especially for rural Canadians, have been called into question and given greater critical scrutiny. And yeah, there is a constituency across this country who are bridling against that and wondering, where they fit in to the narrative with this government of how much a part of the Canadian story they are. I think that was a big part of what you saw with those who came to Ottawa. And I'm not speaking about validating what we saw there, but I am saying that is and it ties into what we're seeing too with that lack of support from the male voters with the Liberals right now. And again, this could just simply be the moment in history that the government is faced with right now. In other words, this is above and beyond how a government can effectively. The government has to respond to what is emerged, of course, what we know now, and yet by the same token, the government has to speak to those Canadians who consider it, as I said, foundational about their Canadian identity, how to inject that spirit of patriotism again? That is a larger question, and I don't know how a government can answer that within a short time frame, within a 2 to 4 year mandate, because these are larger, historical legacy questions that we're dealing with now.
I think it is a big issue, and I hope we can chat about it further, because I think it's got to be something that develops over time. I think it comes down to, I don't think Canada was ever about just freedom, that rallying cry of that image that we saw from February with the topless unshirted guy that was high on meth that was yelling freedom at the top of his lungs. That's New Hampshire, live free or die. Canada was peace, order, and good government. Canada was freedom plus responsibility, freedom plus community.
That's right.
But it's a complicated message to make. And so somehow I think that we've got to redefine, maybe not redefine, but we got to find the right image for what Canada is all about, which is not, I don't believe, just freedom. And, lots of things that you've identified, whether they be, the freedom that some hockey players felt that they had, that, society clearly has said, no, you don't have that freedom. And the freedom that, other people think they have had, that I think that we in the past have had a different attitude toward, restricting freedom for the benefit of the community, that you've got to combine freedom with responsibility for your fellow citizen. But it hasn't been made as of yet. Though, as we go back to the book that you mentioned earlier, the quote was that something over 70% of the people actually supported the vaccine mandates and the masking. There was only something like 25 to 30%, sizable, small minority, but only a minority of people that supported the occupation. Actually, I think the one poll I saw was only 15%. Still, again, that's 4.5 million people, but only 15%. Anyway, John, I really appreciate you chatting with us tonight. I would think it was a fascinating conversation. I loved your article. I thought it was really interesting, and it really comes down. You keep using the basketball analogy. I'll use the football analogy. I think what you're arguing is Trudeau's playing the long game, and Poilievre's playing the short game. Or maybe, to use basketball, Poilievre's going to win the quarter, but basketball, you all know that it's the fourth quarter that counts. And so I think that's what you're arguing. The Trudeau government and the cabinet are currently playing. I also really like the idea that you've talked about, that the Trudeau government was about Trudeau in the past. And frankly, he saved the Liberal Party from the demise that it was undergoing during the Dion and Ignatieff years. There's no question. But today, you yourself have mentioned Chrystia Freeland probably half a dozen times, and there is a team that is there. And in basketball, and in football, and in hockey, you need a team.
I would extend that analogy by any closing words to say that, I think the government is hoping that its 3-point game will be those economic tangibles over the next 6 months. And let's hope all of a sudden they do have a great third and fourth quarter.
John Delacourt, thanks so much for joining us. That's our show for tonight, everybody. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. on 960 AM. You can stream me online at saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.